So let me introduce our first storyteller, Tom Brumm. He's going to tell you about Be Careful with Assumptions.
Thanks, Michael. So it's the summer of 2016, and I took a colleague with me to see the work that I've been doing in Uganda. I'm part of the Cal Service Learning Program in Kamuli, which is a very rural district in Uganda, where we take ISU students, match them with Ugandan university students, and then work in primary schools. I'd started applying my research in post-harvest technology to help solve some problems the schools have been having storing maize, we call it corn, that they use in their school lunch program. Sometimes school lunch is the only good meal that these pupils have all day. And maize weevils have been getting into the stored maize, and left uncontrolled, these insects can consume more than 50% of the maize that's in storage before it can be used. So at Iowa State, through the Cal Center of Sustainable Rural Livelihood, we operate as an NGO in Uganda. You may not have known that. And I'd had some conversations with our staff there and convinced them to start adopting some of the storage alternatives I've been researching. At one of the schools, they put about 500 kilos of maize, about 2 months' worth of school lunches, in a type of metal silo that had been used in other parts of the world. Once it's sealed, the silo protects the maize from rodents and insects, and the insects use up all the oxygen and die. I was really excited to share my progress with my colleague. I hadn't been there since the previous year, but we arrived at the school and looked at the silo, and I opened up the top and was going to show them this beautiful maize, and here's what we saw. Ooh. So the maize was overrun with thousands of maize weevils. We were on the verge of completely losing that whole silo full of maize. I was shocked, sickened, and frankly a little embarrassed. How had I failed them? So let's step back a few years. I'm an agricultural engineer. My area of expertise is post-harvest technology, everything that happens to crops and biomass after it leaves the field. Drying, handling, storing, processing, utilization. After my PhD, and before becoming a faculty member, I worked for a small foundation seed company, directing their specialty genetics programs, developing vertically integrated supply chains to provide varieties of corn and soybeans that were healthier and required less processing. In those years, I learned a lot about taking care of seed after it left the field. In 2000, I became a faculty member here at Iowa State. My research focuses on post-harvest technologies to improve U.S. agriculture. Things like processing efficiency, quality management, the relationship between value and quality, those kind of things. I'm also a member of St. Thomas Aquinas here in Ames, and we have a sister parish in Honduras. And a former staff member from St. Thomas is working there. And in 2009, he organized a meeting of parishioners that had agricultural experience to talk about what they were doing there, trying to improve food security and agriculture for the people there in their parish. He told us that they'd tried planting soybeans, and they worked really good, and they supplied oil and protein, but when they saved the seed back to plant the next generation, they didn't germinate. Thinking back to my experience in the seed industry, I said, well, you have to keep the seed cool in order for it to germinate. And he looked at me and he said, we had no idea. And I was kind of taken aback. I thought, well, isn't that obvious? What else was in my head that could be the difference between people eating and going hungry? So I was mulling this over, wondering what to do. And then 2 days later, I ran into David Acker. You may know David as the Associate Dean in CALS for Global Programs. And he said, hey, Tom, how'd you like to go to Uganda? Well, I might be slow, but I'm not stupid. It was obvious to me that God was sending me a message, so I accepted, and I've been working in the service learning program ever since. During my first few years of travel there, I began to see the post-harvest challenges faced by smallholder farmers. Maize is a staple for most Ugandans, providing most of the calories that they consume each day. In the U.S., we harvest and shell large fields of corn with machinery, make it safe for storage by drying it with hot air, and keep it in steel grain bins until sale or use. But in Uganda, maize fields are an acre or two, harvested and shelled by hand by the smallholder farmers. They dry the maize on the ground in the sun, and then they put the maize in woven polypropylene bags and store them in their house. So the maize weevil is a pest known around the world. Infestation starts in the field before harvest. The female drills a little hole, lays an egg, and then the developing pupa and larvae eat the kernel from the inside out as they grow. And when they're mature, they drill a little hole and exit, leaving behind an empty shell. A single female weevil can lay hundreds of eggs in its lifetime. In 30 days, one weevil becomes hundreds. In 60 days, it becomes thousands and thousands and thousands. So in just a couple of months, the weevil can eat much of the maize in a storage bag. And in a food insecure place like Uganda, it's the difference between going hungry and having extra money to pay your children's school fees. So here in the US, we don't have a big weevil problem. In Iowa, it's cold. That kills weevils. And if we do have a weevil problem, we just call a professional, and they come out and they fumigate it with some chemical that's toxic to weevils, and we're just fine. But in Uganda and similar places, there's no cold weather to kill insects, and smallholder farmers really can't afford fumigants and really struggle to use them safely. So this poses an interesting research question. How do you control weevils without using temperature or chemicals? My research, in collaboration with colleagues here at Iowa State and other institutions, looks at practical and affordable ways to maintain quality and quantity of harvested crops, especially grains and beans, and edible beans. I didn't come up with the idea of hermetic storage, but there's lots of ways that can be applied. Barrels, bags, silos, jerry cans, all sorts of things. There are plenty of scientific questions to be answered. Things like, what's the minimum level of oxygen for a weevil to survive? Or what's the oxygen permeability of the materials that we're making the storage containers? Or what's the interactions between oxygen, carbon dioxide, and time to insect mortality? But perhaps the most important question is, how will the results of my research be used? That silo of maize in Uganda didn't become infested with weevils because hermetic storage didn't work. I assumed that our staff there would know, just as I knew, that sealing that silo was really important, and that particular type of silo was difficult to seal. I'd failed to properly communicate the results of my research, and I failed to train the staff adequately. Research is not about just discovering new knowledge. Ensuring that that new knowledge is applied effectively is just as important. I can't assume that everyone knows what I know, and I certainly can't assume that I know everything. So that silo full of maize in the school in Uganda wasn't lost. We obtained and used a fumigant, killed all the weevils, cleaned it, and safely used the maize. We no longer use this type of silo, but now we're distributing plastic hermetic silos that are much more foolproof. We added a post-harvest specialist to our staff there to implement better post-harvest practices and conduct trainings. The 5 schools at which we work are now storing maize without insect problems. Farmers in the area are starting to use plastic hermetic silos. More maize is being eaten by people and less by insects. Implementing hermetic storage has already improved this food security for thousands of people in rural Uganda. Well, my research continues. We're looking at other methods to control weevils besides hermetic storage. New questions consistently arise for which there are no clear ways to answer them. But the answers, along with care in applying those answers, can help the lives of people far removed from Ames, Iowa, just as long as I'm careful about the assumptions that I make. Thank you.